This here, we cannot find the exact values of the mean and the standard deviation without the raw data, so we can, we're just going to say approximate. So these aren't going to be exactly right, but we're just going to do an approximation of what we think they're going to be. Using this stuff. Okay. So again, I've got it by hand, but I think we're just going to skip the one by hand for now. I'll talk about why we do it, why we have this formula right here, basically what we're doing with it when we get through it, but we won't go through and do all the math. We'll just do it in our calculator. So we've got this formula. It's going to be the same exact thing for each of them. It's just one's x bar and one's mu, whatever. The letters that they use right here, x sub I, that's going to be the midpoint, so we're going to have to talk about how to find the midpoints. And we're going to have to do that even when we put it into our calculator. We have to find the midpoints for these frequency distributions. So we have to do that. F is the frequency of your class, so how many numbers are in that class. And N is just going to be the number of classes, but we're really not going to use that at all when we put it in. So, all right, and then they have this part right here, how to find the midpoint. All right, different textbooks do it different ways, but our textbook says you're going to look at that class's lower class limit and the next class's lower class limit, and you're going to average those things together. So add them together and divide by 2. Again, with this one, just like when we did class width, don't use the upper class limits at all, leave those out of it. You're just going to look at the lower class limits when you go through and figure out your midpoint. So they have this example right here. We're looking at first year students and how much time they spend preparing for class each week. We're going to approximate the mean number of hours spent. So here we go. Right. So here's our frequency distribution. It's written kind of horizontally. On the next page, it's written again vertically, just to make it kind of nice. Here's your classes. Here's your frequency. But right here in your xi, those are going to be your midpoints. We're not going to do this part right here, but we are going to go through and figure out what our midpoint is for each of them. All right, so midpoints, right here. It's going to be the lower class limit plus the next class's lower class limit, and we're going to divide it by 2 when we do those things. So for the first one, our lower class limit is 1. I'm going to put okay, so 1 is my lower class limit plus, and then my next class's lower class limit is 6. And I'm going to divide that by 2. So I'm actually going to get a 3.5 for my midpoint on that one. You don't want to do 1 plus 5 divided by 2 to get 3. You don't want to use these upper class limits here at all. You're only sticking to the lower class limits. All right, and then if we do the next one, down here, 6 is my lower class limit. The next class's lower class limit is 11. If I divide that by 2, it's 17 divided by 2, which is 8.5. And then if I do it for the third class, I do 11 plus 16 over 2. That's 27 over 2, which is 13.5. Does anybody see a pattern yet? Yeah, we're just adding by 5 each time. So 5 is our class width, because if you look over here at your time, from 1 to 6, 6 to 11, 11 to 16, we're just adding 5 each time. Same thing with our upper class limits, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20. So we can do that. Same thing with our midpoints here. We can just add 5 each time, so you don't have to keep doing that calculation in your calculator. Just add 5 each time to make it go a little bit faster. 18.5, 23.5, 8.5. here's the logic behind if we did it by hand, what we would do, and what the calculator actually does behind the scenes that we don't actually see the calculations for. Okay, so we've got numbers in this interval right here, 1 hours to 5 hours, but we don't know what those actual numbers are. So we could say, well, let's just assume they're all 1 hour, but that's going to kind of be an underrepresentation because you might have some people who had more. You could use 5 hours, but that would kind of be an overrepresentation because you're going to have people who probably did less. So what they're going to do is they're going to take what's called the midpoint, the number that's right in the middle of those two. And so if they go straight down the line, yeah, you're going to have some people who studied less, you're going to have some people who studied more, but on average it should kind of even out a little bit. So that's why they go with the midpoint for those. So if we take just one person in that interval, we're just going to assume that that person studied around 3.5 hours. So if we're off by maybe 1.5 hours, 2.5 hours, something like that, but really not a whole lot. We won't be off by too much. Okay, so we're going to just assume the people in this class studied for 3.5 hours each on average. Okay, but there's 130 of them altogether. So if we were doing this in our calculator, we would say 3.5 is the number that we're using for these people. So I'm going to write down 3.5 130 times. But that's going to take too much work. So what they do, instead of taking the 3.5 and adding to itself 130 times, they just change it to multiplication because that's the definition of multiplication. So that's why here they multiply the 3.5 times the 130, just to save you from having to add that number to itself 130 times. And they'll do that same thing here, 8.5 per person for 250 people, multiply them together. And so once you multiply those two things together over here and add this column together, that's going to be the total number of hours approximately that was spent by all of these students altogether. So the total number of hours spent by all of these students, divide it then by how many people you have altogether, all of these frequencies added together, and that would be your average. So that would be the idea behind what we're doing to approximate this, is everybody in this group, we're assuming that they're going to study around 3.5 hours. But doing this chart, writing out everything, it takes a long time. It's much easier just to do it in your calculator. So that's what we're going to do right here. It's going to be very similar. We're still going to use one-bar stats, but the problem is we don't just have our data values anymore. Now we have our frequency list. So if you do have one of those newer computers where you have this screen, yours is going to be different than what it used to be. If you don't, if you have one like mine, it's going to be, you have to remember to do this step. It's kind of complicated. So we're still going to put all of our data in. So we're going to put the midpoint into L1.